Well, good afternoon, brethren. I want to welcome and thank everyone for tuning in and joining us from the various locations from around the world for the broadcast of today's Sabbath message. Today's message will be delivered by David J. Smith, and it is titled, History That Must Be Told. And I'm your host today, Tim West. This is message number 1337B, and David J. first delivered this message on August 21st, 2007. Well, the last new moon sighting was on the evening of last Sunday, April 7th, just after sunset, which marks the 30th day after the last sighting of the new moon. So, for those of you who have decided to wait until after the equinox to look for the new moon, Passover will be the evening of Sunday, April 21st. And that is 1 week from tomorrow. And brethren, I have a prayer request from a sister in Christ, so stay tuned after today's message and I will fill you in on the details. The message is about to begin here momentarily, so grab something to sip on, some lunch, and your favorite snack, or your favorite snack. Find a comfortable place to relax and enjoy today's message.
The book of Revelation tells us in chapter 13 that there is a rise of the end-time social system that will come that will end up fighting Jesus Christ at his return. This is a series called The History That Must Be Told, Part 2, that sets about to prove that that social system is upon us right now. Let's go back in history just a little bit. The theological or religious dogma of a man by the name of Albert Pike is laid out in the instructions that he issued July 14th, 1889. He presented this to the 23 Supreme Council of Freemasonry all over the world. Here's what he said, and I quote, "That which we must say to the crowd, that is, non-Masons and the lower degrees of 32nd degree down, is that we worship a God, but it is a God one adores without superstition. In other words, we'll see Lucifer. To you, sovereign grand instructor generals, we say this, that you may repeat it to the brethren of the 32nd, 31st, and 30th degrees, that we believe in a God. The Masonic religion should be, by all of us initiates of the high degrees, maintained in the purity of the Luciferian doctrine. If Lucifer were not God, would Adonai, that's the Christian God according to them, whose deeds prove cruelty, perfidy, that's a lack of allegiance, and hatred of men, barbarism and repulsion for science, would Adonai and his priests, that means ministers, calumniate, that means falsely accuse Lucifer. Yes, Lucifer is God, as he says, and so the Masonic religion at the highest degree, the hand-selected 33rd degree, is Lucifer, the worship of Satan, the devil. Remember at this time that he wrote this, that Albert Pike was the head of the ancient and accepted Scottish Rite of Freemasonry worldwide. And here's what the Bible says in Revelation 13, verse 2, the last part. And the dragon, that's Satan, according to Revelation 12:9, gave him his power, his seat, and great authority. So it is Satan the devil, Lucifer, who rebelled against God, his name was changed to Satan, that is behind this system. In a very remarkable letter dated August 15th, 1871, it was on display at the British Museum Library in London, England, until about 1977. Albert Pike gave great details, the plans for 3 world wars. There would also be many revolutionary wars. This was to bring them to the brink of establishing their one world government under the authority of Lucifer or Satan the devil, their man, the Antichrist, sitting upon a throne. Here's what he stated about the third of these wars. We, meaning the Illuminati, worshippers of Lucifer, shall unleash the nihilist and atheist, and we shall promote a formidable social cataclysm, which in all of its horror will show clearly to the nations the effect of absolute atheism, which is the origin of savagery and of the most bloody turmoil. Then everywhere the citizens obliged to defend themselves against the world minority of revolutionaries will exterminate these destroyers of civilization, and the multitude will then be disillusioned with Christianity. They will have nowhere to turn their adoration, and so for the first time the pure doctrine of Lucifer will be finally brought out into the light, which will follow the destruction of Christianity and atheism, both conquered and exterminated at the same time. End of quote. So there is a plan, a plot to create a world government. It's called the Antichrist system in most circles in Christianity. According to Albert Pike, 3 world wars would be necessary to obtain world government. The first took place in 1914 to 1918. It would destroy Tsarist Russia and place that vast territory under the Illuminati's control. This way they would have a working base, a country to work from to overthrow by the use of revolution. The Second World War was manipulated between the differences between the political Zionists and the German nationalists. This would lead to the expansion of Russian power and the creation of the State of Israel in Palestine. That happened in 1948. The Third War would be started by stirring up the differences between the State of Israel and the Arab radical Muslims. And what do we see today in the Middle East? We've seen World War I, we've seen World War II. Now we're seeing the difference in the State of Israel and the Muslims and anybody that joins in as an ally in the Middle East with little tiny Israel. They are the target of Muslimism. So this final war would drag the Western world of Christianity into a conflict with Russia and China. These are the communist worlds that would be allied with the Arabs, other African countries under communist rule, and Central and South America, which has already turned wholesale to socialism, and in some states call themselves communism. Now let's go back in history to bring you up to date a little bit on what is happening that is laying the groundwork for all this. During the time of England's colonial expansion, the British East India Merchant Company was earning a vast fortune in the opium trade. The British East India Company created the Inland Mission, whose primary purpose was to get the Chinese coolies, the workers, hooked on opium and to create a market for their merchandise. The British royal family, attracted by these tremendous profits, joined in the British East India Company. The Crown levied a tax on all registered opium producers in India. Huge amounts of opium were shipped out of India on the China tea clippers, they were called. The tremendous profits of the East India Company were made not by transporting tea. Almost 13% of the income of India under British rule was derived from this high quality of opium called Bengal opium, and it was operated by the British. They distributed it in China. However, the royal family didn't want their subjects to know that they were in the business of opium trade. So they enacted the British National Secrecy Acts. This was to hide the darker side of the British national government, and so it was that they created what is called M16, their secret service, their secret intelligence services that has stayed with us to this very day, as typified by the movies James Bond, Agent 007. M16 dates back to the time of Queen Elizabeth I, when Sir Francis Walsingham began the paymaster of M16's Dirty Tricks Department. With several centuries of experience, M16 was developed into the world's primary intelligence agency. From 1791 to 1894, the number of licensed opium companies in British-administered Shanghai went from 87 to 663. This eventually led directly to the Opium Wars in China. This is history that needs to be told. The British East India Company had no competition for the opium trade for about a century, until the Chinese government began to pass laws against opium smoking in 1729. By this time, the British East India Company had formed what was called the Committee of 300 to deal with international commerce and banking to secure their position on the world market. This committee developed tactics to counter the Chinese anti-opium smoking laws, and soon the Opium Wars were underway. A man by the name of Lord Inchcap founded the P&O Steamship Company and was principal founder of the Hong Kong and Shanghai banks, which laundered the opium trade revenue through them. Other British banks involved in the narcotics trade were the British Bank of the Middle East, Midland Bank, National and Westminster Bank, Barclays Bank, the Royal Bank of Canada, and Baring Brothers Bank. All are interlocked with Rothschild banks through the Committee of 300. When the Harriman-owned railroad was being built to connect California with the eastern United States, thousands of Chinese coolies were brought in as labor. The hope was that they would be addicted to opium and would open up a vast opium trade in the United States of America. Because of the many anti-Jewish laws in Europe, many Jews were landless and were international wanderers, just having to make a living the best they could. No matter which country they inhabited, they bonded together in unity. They were known as internationalists, without any national loyalty to any country. Toward the end of the 19th century, Tsarist Russia was considered the last real obstacle to the Illuminati's rule of the world. Remember, there's two distinct types of Jews. Number one, the bloodline tribe of Judah, and number two, proselytes that accepted the religion of Judaism, such as the Khazars of Turkish origin that migrated to the steppe countries of Western Europe. It's the Khazars that founded international banking and communism and Zionism. In 1881, in Odessa, Russia, Theodor Herzl founded the Zionist movement to create a homeland in Palestine for the Jews. The racial tribe of Judah was only one of the 12 tribes of Israelites. The other tribes were taken into national captivity way back in 721 to 718 BC. The book of Ezekiel was written in 586 BC telling what it would be like for them at the end of the age. They were sifted through the nations, only to lose their national identity because they quit keeping the seventh-day Sabbath as they traveled overland through Europe and went to the British Isles and then later to the United States of America. But Theodor Herzl, a Khazar Jew and founder of Zionism, wrote a letter to the Rothschilds. Quote, "Nothing prevents us from being and remaining the exponents of a united humanity. When we have a country of our own, to fulfill this mission, we do not literally have to remain planted among the nations that hate us and despise us. If in our present circumstances we wanted to bring about the unity of mankind independent of national borders, we would have to combat the ideal of patriotism. Patriotism will prove stronger than we are for years to come." End of quote. In New York, at a B'nai B'rith meeting, Jacob Schiff, who is also a Khazar Jew, president of Kuhn Loeb and Company, was appointed chairman of the Committee of the Revolutionary Movement in Russia. On January 13th, 1917, Leon Trotsky, who happened to also be a Khazar Jew, as were 83% of the first Comintern of Russia, he arrived in the United States of America and received a United States passport. He was frequently seen emerging from the palatial residence of Jacob Schiff. Trotsky and another Khazar Jew by the name of V.I. Lenin, the first ruthless dictator of communist Russia, were both managed by the Committee of 300 through a man by the name of Bruce Lockhart. At these meetings, the Zionists organized the agitations of the 1905 attempted revolution of Russia. Then they discussed their failures and how they would succeed the next time. Now let's go back in time for just a moment. This Committee of 300 used a man by the name of Karl Marx as a front. The Illuminati attempted to implement their plan for a worldwide social revolution. It proved a total failure. Marx's teachings never really fired up the people, those who were the working class in society. In London in 1864, Marx organized the International Working Man's Association. Later it became known as the First Socialist International. Their headquarters were moved to New York 8 years later. Shortly afterward, they emerged with a socialist party that had been founded there in 1868. So the Second Socialist International, founded in Paris on the 14th of July, 1889, resulted from the realization that the workers of the world would not really answer the call to overthrow their governments. So they needed to be manipulated through infiltration into organizations, labor organizations, infiltration into government, religion, every segment of society. This began at a later time to have success. But it was at this juncture in history that the Fabian Society and V.I. Lenin's Bolsheviks made their entrance onto the world scene and began to make headway in achieving the goals outlined by Adam Weishaupt, then later Roosevelt, then later Karl Marx, and then Albert Pike. The only real difference between these two groups was the methods by which they were working for the same overall goal. They wanted to create a classless society, a socialistic one-world society as envisioned by Karl Marx. That information could be found in a manifesto, Fabian Tract number 2, written in 1884. Since that time, the Bolsheviks, or communists as they became known, have been working to bring about world government by violence. Consistent revolutions all over the world, especially in what is termed as the third and fourth world countries. The Fabians, however, derived their tactics of very slow infiltration and taking over corridors of power from a Roman general by the name of Fabius, the Delayer, because of his deliberate long-range plans. And so he had strategy over a longer period of time instead of immediate violence. As a result, from the very outset, the Fabian Society worked for a new world order. Through indoctrination of young scholars in the belief that eventually these intellectual revolutionists would gain power and influence in all the opinion-making and power-wielding agencies of the world. This would help them to achieve their goals of world government. Their tactics became known as the doctrine of the inevitability of gradualism. Organizations designed for infiltration are such as the Rhodes Scholars, founded by Cecil Rhodes in England, the Council on Foreign Relations in the United States of America, the Trilateral Commission, founded by David Rockefeller in America. And in Great Britain, they had their own counterparts through which they would infiltrate every lever of power in government in Canada, Australia, South America, or South Africa, and all the countries that were a part of the Commonwealth. So the real powers, though, behind the scenes that manipulated it all were the international power brokers. A Professor Carroll Quigley tells us what happened during the latter part of the 19th century. He said that the international bankers and their European and American counterparts moved into commercial banking and insurance on one side and into railroading and heavy industry on the other side. So they were to dominate completely the entirety of the economic scene in the United States of America and Great Britain and the European continent. They were popularly known as the Society, or 400 men, which later came down to 300. They lived a life of dazzling splendor, sailing the oceans in great private yachts, traveling on land by their own private trains, rail cars. They had great ceremonies when they would go into New York to the theaters. They owned palatial houses in Palm Beach, Long Island, the Berkshires, Newport, and Bar Harbor in Maine. J.P. Morgan was one of the greatest manipulators in the United States, heading up this group, allied with the Rothschilds of England. The Astor family also was a part of those who control commerce and banking and industry in the United States of America. As Professor Carroll Quigley went on telling in his book, Tragedy and Hope, he said the structure of financial controls created by the tycoons of big banking and big business was very complex. They would have mixed and cross board of directors to confuse the populace if they tried to look into the background of their businesses and find who it was that was controlling everything. But usually in New York City, J.P. Morgan and Company were the ones who led the wealth of the nation. And then the Rockefeller family in Ohio with their Standard Oil Company. And when these two combine their economic clout, they usually control the country absolutely. This was found on page 71 and 73 of Carroll Quigley's book, Tragedy and Hope. It should be noted that for more than 200 years, these international banking families had dominated the European scene after they had succeeded in establishing the Bank of England. They established other central banks in Germany, France, Italy, and Switzerland. Since that coup of coups in 1815, when they literally bought control of England for a couple of cents on the dollar, they obtained the right to create money instead of the government of England doing it. All their efforts to foist a permanent central bank on the United States had met with failure, even though they did assassinate two separate presidents because of their objecting to the bankers taking over control of the money system. Our Constitution gave the Congress alone the authority to coin money and regulate the value thereof. So the international bankers were out in the cold. They used a created panic of 1907. J.P. Morgan is the one that created it, as an example of America's great need for a central banking authority. So they began a vast propaganda campaign that was launched to sell to the American people the idea of a centralized bank. The Federal Reserve System is a central bank, and it came into being when the Federal Reserve was passed, the Federal Reserve Act, in the House of Representatives and the Senate late in December of 1913. Under the Federal Reserve Act, the bankers were granted the privilege of creating money out of nothing and then lending it to the United States government at interest. The way had now been prepared to loot the greatest and richest nation on the face of the earth. In 1792, the first bank of the United States was established through the efforts of a few unprincipled men such as Alexander Hamilton. The funding for this bank came from the Rothschilds in London, England. The objective behind the bank was to receive a special privilege to use the unjust fractional reserve banking to print money and loan it to the government and industry. No money could ever go into circulation without interest being paid to the bankers. Fractional reserve banking is a very simple act. It's simply a special privilege given to a man or a group of men that creates credit. That's all they create, credit. They get the government in debt. They get the nation, the citizens in debt, businesses in debt. And for anyone that does not go into debt, someone else has to eventually file bankruptcy because it is a debt system and no one can ever get out from under its clutches when it's been worked long enough. So the basic mathematics behind the system is very clear. If the system is left in place long enough, the man or the men who controls the system of debt will own all the gold available. And once a supply of real money, that's precious metals, gold, silver, is in their hands, this man or group of men are the masters of the economics of the entirety of the nation. This is why those who wanted a central bank would do anything. They would lie, steal, cheat, and even murder to allow it to be going into existence so that they could become fabulously rich and eventually own the nation. So this is what was happening between 1862 and 1933, the consolidation of the banking industry in America, consolidation of industry in the hands of a few people that made them fabulously rich. As a direct result, they now control everything of the economic life in America. How long this process takes to work is based upon how well the banker does his job. Can he bribe senators, House of Representative members? Can he cause corruption in government? Abraham Lincoln said that he foresaw this coming. That because if a banking system was centralized in America, businesses and the bankers would buy off politicians and corrupt the nation, and we would lose our Republican form of government. There were warnings that had been issued by bankers themselves and others who understood this banking. One of those bankers was Baron Nathan Mayer Rothschild. He said, "Let me issue and control a nation's money, and I care not who writes the laws." Very astounding statement. President Andrew Jackson said, and I'm quoting, "You bankers who want to issue the nation's currency are a den of vipers. I intend to rout you out. If the people only understood the rank injustice of our money and banking system, there would be a revolution before morning." End of quote. Of course, the people in America do not understand the injustice of this system, and since our representatives, many of them, or most of them, receive perks from the bankers and industrialists and lobbyists, our senators and representatives, they're not going to shut down the very thing that makes them rich. How can a man make $250,000 a year and then go to Washington and become filthy rich when the pay is less than that? And yet congressmen, congresswomen do exactly that. Notice what Congressman Louis McFadden, fierce patriot of America, said in his collective speeches, page 326, quote, "Every effort has been made by the Federal Reserve Board to conceal its power, but the truth is the Federal Reserve Board has usurped the government of the United States. It controls everything here and controls our foreign relations. It makes and breaks governments at will." End of quote. The money power preys upon the nation in times of peace, and it conspires against it in times of adversity. It's more despotic than a monarch, a king. It's more insolent than autocracy. It's more selfish than bureaucracy. This is what President Abraham Lincoln said. He said, "I see in the near future a crisis approaching that unnerves me and causes me to tremble for the safety of my country. Corporations have been enthroned. An era of corruption in high places will follow, and the money power of the country will endeavor to prolong its reign by working upon the prejudices of the people until the wealth is aggregated in a few hands and the republic is destroyed." End of quote. Abraham Lincoln's statement right after the National Banking Act of 1863 was passed into law. giving private bankers a charter to operate in America. Here's what President Garfield thought about it. He thought that if there were international bankers that took control, the nation would be doomed. To be exact, President Garfield, because he fought against the international bankers, was assassinated by the Illuminati. Lincoln was assassinated by the Illuminati's agent, John Wilkes Booth. President Garfield, shortly before he was assassinated, had declared that whoever controls the supply of currency would control the business and activities of all the people in America. There's a country, and most people have heard about it, and how they had such privacy in banking. They would not reveal who had bank accounts there. It's called Switzerland. In 1815, at the Congress of Vienna, the state of Switzerland was established in its present-day form. It existed before, but not in its present-day form. It was guaranteed perpetual neutrality. This nation became necessary for the bankers and their agents so that they could manage both sides of European wars behind the scenes as they reaped millions in profits. This included World War I and World War II. It was in this nation called Switzerland that the new international court was based upon the bankers' private law of contracts. So Switzerland was established for bankers and by bankers in its present-day form. For instance, it was this court in Geneva, Switzerland, that the bankruptcy of the United States government was administered for the benefit of private bankers, money barons that President Lincoln and Congressman McFadden had warned about. But in 1933, we were declared bankrupt because we had had a Federal Reserve Act and all money issued had to have interest paid on it. So we went into bankruptcy as a nation. In 1816, the second bank of the United States was established that reintroduced fractional reserve banking in America. It was a private bank, for profit, that our forefathers tried to assure would never happen in America so that we could remain prosperous. They wrote into the Constitution, Article 1, Section 8, I quote, "The Congress shall have power to coin money, regulate the value thereof," end of quote. No private individual or banking cartel was to have a privilege of coining money and regulating the value of that money. Only Congress. Yet today we see Congress tremble when the head of the Federal Reserve goes up and reports to Congress. They tremble that the interest rates may go up and the economy of America will go down the tubes just a little more. In 1829, members of the Illuminati in America sponsored a series of lectures in New York. It was held by an English Illuminati agent, Francis Wright. Those present were informed that the Order of the Illuminati intended to unite the nihilist and the atheist groups that were all subversive organizations into one organization known as communism. This was 1829. Francis Wright advocated the entire Illuminati program of founder Adam Weishaupt, which included communism made more palatable or acceptable by using the labels of equal opportunity, equal rights, atheism, emancipation of women, free love. Have we heard any of these phrases since the 1960s? They're everywhere. It's what our government is based upon today. Communist slogans. This new destructive force called communism was to be used to foment wars and revolutions, including the American Civil War, or war between the states. Clinton Roosevelt, Charles Dana, and Horace Greeley were appointed as a committee to raise funds for this new undertaking in America. This information was found in the book Fourth Reich of the Rich, page 59. A second Bank of the United States charter ended. When the Second Bank of the United States charter expired in 1836, President Andrew Jackson would not renew it. In 1833, President Andrew Jackson ordered the considerable deposits of the federal government removed from the Central Bank of the United States and transferred to several smaller banks. A man by the name of Nicholas Biddle, head of the central bank, was determined to undermine Jackson by ordering a sharp reduction in loans throughout the banking system. The inevitable result was a sharp contraction in business activities and an economic panic. He purposely created a financial panic to blackmail the government into rechartering the bank. Jackson warned the American people, I quote, "The bold effort the present bank had made to control the government, the distress it had wantonly produced, are but premonitions of the fate that awaits the American people should they be deluded into a perpetuation of this institution or the establishment of another like it." End of quote. This came from The Occult Technology of Power, page 22. According to historian Arthur Schlesinger Jr., in his book The Age of Jackson, page 6 and 7, President Jackson told the Vice President, Martin Van Buren, quote, "The bank, Mr. Van Buren, is trying to kill me," end of quote. The Order of the Illuminati is headed by these international bankers. Their plan is to get the entire world of business upon speculation, such as the stock market around the world, based upon paper money that has no real value, that's not backed by gold or silver. They plan to have a giant worldwide crash. But they've accumulated the gold into their own coffers. Everyone else will go into bankruptcy, but they will have the financial resources to see the crash through. In 1837, a severe depression, along with a bank panic, swept America as the central bank, this is a private bank now, pulled their money out of the economy. This was in revenge for President Jackson not renewing the charter the previous year. Also in 1837, and sometimes before, the Bank of England, owned by Rothschilds, began to send their agents into the South to begin planning for a civil war and the destruction of the Union. They wanted control and couldn't have it, based upon the Constitution. The Illustrated History, University History, written in 1878, page 504, tells us that the southern states swarmed with British agents. Of course, today we understand that they were really Rothschild agents. They were just from Britain. The reasons given for the American military to become involved in World War I were found to be fraudulent. 25 years after the war ended, American historians Charles A. and Mary R. Beard stated that, quote, the gleaming mirage that pictured the World War as purely or even mainly a war for democracy and civilization dissolved beyond recognition, end of quote. A man by the name of Walter Lippmann, who was found to be a socialist and promoting world government, stated that the real reasons for going to war in 1917 had never been admitted. He stated that, and it was in our U.S. Foreign Policy, page 24. He said, quote, many people realize that this mystifying situation in which an alleged democratic and self-governing nation is actually controlled against the will of the people in its foreign affairs is a clear indication that there must be a very powerful and well-financed secret organization which plans and directs American foreign affairs. And for lack of a more specific identification, this suspected secret organization is popularly referred to as international financiers, end of quote. That came from a book called The Empire of the City. I personally have been to the city, a 1 square mile of financial institutions, downtown London, England. It is not a part of the country of England. It is private. When the Queen goes or King goes to the city to greet the mayor, the King or Queen of England bows to the mayor. The international banking family of Lord Rothschild owns that 1 square mile section of land in London called the city. Every entrance into it are dragons on poles. Weather worn, the red has worn off of most of them. It's still on a few here and there. It was not controlled by the British government. This is basically the financial center of the world. It sets the price of gold for these bankers' own purposes. They're not subject to England's laws. The city is totally independent and controls the British Parliament to an astonishing degree through finance, because they control the banks of England that supplies the money. Foreign policy decisions are made here. They're passed down to the debtor nations of Britain and the United States to carry through with their plan for world domination. Practically no incidents happens in the world without participants by the city in some form or another. The city is supported in the United States by the secret International Pilgrim Society, sponsored by the Cecil Rhodes One World ideology that was launched about 1897. The late president of its American branch was Dr. Nicholas Murray, who was also president of the Allied Carnegie Foundation Endowment for World Peace. The ultimate objective of this program of the city is the destiny of the pure Aryan Anglo-Saxon race to dominate the world and kill off or reduce to a servile status all other inferior races, end of quote. Now we can begin to see clearly why world events have happened as they have the AIDS virus planted in Africa. The slaughter of millions of people that were not white Aryans, because the Illuminati feels that white people are the superior race. A man by the name of Aaron Burr, between 1800 and 1819, worked feverishly for Massachusetts and New England states to secede from the Union, the newly formed United States of America. Because of his activities in New England, he fled to New York, then on to South Carolina. He moved on to New Orleans for other subversive activities. Another Illuminati agent by the name of Edward Livingston left New York to settle in New Orleans also. A trail of intrigue continued when John Slidell, son of a New York banker, moved to New Orleans, where he was to be trained by Edward Livingston concerning the plan of the Illuminati. Livingston and Slidell became United States senators from Louisiana. John Slidell became the chief director of Louisiana's secession movement. He also served as Confederate envoy to France. He eventually died in England, where the leader of the Illuminati, after Adam Weishaupt's death, by the name of Giuseppe Mazzini, had moved his headquarters. A man by the name of Judah Benjamin was born in the British West Indies. He, along with his parents, moved to Charleston, South Carolina. In 1828, Judah Benjamin moved to New Orleans. He was hired as a legal clerk by John Slidell in 1834. Benjamin also became a United States senator from Louisiana. It was Judah Benjamin that proposed that Louisiana secede from the Union in 1860. Benjamin served the Confederate government as Attorney General, Secretary of War, and Secretary of State. After the war between the states, he escaped to England and became an English barrister or lawyer, which ranked higher than the Queen's Counsel. A man by the name of Killian Van Rensselaer moved from New York to Cincinnati, Ohio. In 1854, he founded the Knights of the Golden Circle, also called the Sons of Liberty. The Knights were to supply the paramilitary logistics for the South's fighting forces against the North once the war began. Pierre Beauregard of New Orleans was John Slidell's brother-in-law. He joined the Knights of the Golden Circle and was commissioned a general. He was given command at Charleston, South Carolina, in the Confederate Army. On April 12, 1861, he directed the firing on Fort Sumter, and the war between the states began officially. A man by the name of William Yancey of New York was the stepson of a radical abolitionist president of Rensselaer Institute. He moved to South Carolina and entered politics. Later he moved to Alabama and became the leader in the Alabama secessionist movement. In 1860, Yancey led the walkout of the Democratic National Convention being held in Charleston, South Carolina. This walkout split the party when it formed the secessionist Southern Democrats. By splitting the vote, it assured Abraham Lincoln would be elected President of the United States. This is important for later on. Henry de Jure of the powerful de Jure family of Switzerland, a haven created by the international bankers, lived in Charleston, South Carolina. He became the leader of the pro-British Federalist Party that was controlled by the House of Rothschild's international bankers. De Jure played a leading role in the founding of South Carolina College in 1801. The college became the hotbed for Southern secession. Thomas Cooper was born in England. He became a member of the Parliament and was also an abolitionist. He moved to Pennsylvania, where he served 6 months in prison for sedition, undermining the government. He then moved to South Carolina and was hired by Henry de Jure in 1820 to become president of South Carolina College. In 1827, and now a slave owner instead of an abolitionist, Cooper was the first person to propose that the South secede from the Union. Many of Cooper's students at South Carolina College became very influential secessionists. A man by the name of Caleb Huse of Newburyport, Massachusetts, owned the Newbury Post-Herald newspaper in 1822. Huse moved to Alabama and became leader of the Alabama militia. In 1861, he traveled to England to procure rifles for the Confederacy. His newspaper employed Caleb Cushing and William Garrison. Caleb Cushing of Newburyport, Massachusetts, became a United States congressman chairing the House Foreign Relations Committee and also served as the U.S. Attorney General under Franklin Pierce. Cushing was pro-slavery and chaired the Democratic National Convention at Charleston, South Carolina in 1860. William Garrison of Newburyport started his radical abolitionist newspaper. It was called The Liberator in 1831. Garrison was against preserving the Union. He publicly burned a copy of the United States Constitution. Garrison would often go to England to visit the European revolutionary Illuminati agent Giuseppe Mazzini. Giuseppe Mazzini followed in the footsteps of Illuminati founder Adam Weishaupt upon his death. He was an Italian anarchist who worked to topple European governments. In Europe, he started the Young France, the Young England, the Young Italian, and the Young Europe movements to promote radical political and social change called socialism. While working out of England, he met the staunch abolitionists from the North and fire-breathing secessionists from the South, so he played both sides. The Illuminati planned their strategy to stir up both the North and the South against each other for the destruction of the individual nation-states that composed the Union. A man by the name of Edwin de Leon of South Carolina in 1845 became Mazzini's co-founder of the Young America movement to destroy the political and social structure of the United States, to prepare the way for world government by the close of the 20th century or shortly thereafter. De Leon was a student of South Carolina College's Thomas Cooper. De Leon was one of the more obvious connections between abolitionists like Mazzini and secessionists like Thomas Cooper. De Leon served the Confederate government as liaison between Europe and as well as the advisor of the Confederate President Jefferson Davis. The Illuminati controlled both sides, the North and the South. Albert Pike of Newburyport, Massachusetts, moved to Arkansas to promote secession. In 1852, he moved from Arkansas to Charleston, South Carolina. Pike was in the inner circle of the powerful persons working for New England, especially Massachusetts, control of the Southern Confederacy. He was selected by Mazzini to head the Illuminati operations in the United States. But the question has to become, did the original founders of our federal government believe secession was legal, constitutional? And if the federal government did not live up to the Constitution and the Bill of Rights, did they have a right as an individual state to leave the Union? They voted themselves into the Union, so did they have a right to vote themselves out? Several sources have stated that after the Constitutional Convention, several states balked at the idea of a strong centralized government. According to a 7-page booklet published by the Women for Constitutional Government, 7 states included the right of secession in their acts of ratification of the Constitution. According to this booklet, 4 of these 7 states were New York, Rhode Island, Massachusetts, and New Hampshire. These states could not be considered the heart of Dixie. They were northern states. And they believed that they had the right to secede at any time from the Union. The delegates for the nation-state of Virginia, in their ratification statement, expressed the right of secession most clearly because they wrote, and I quote, "We, the delegates of the people of Virginia, duly elected, do, in the name and behalf of the people of Virginia, declare and make known that the powers granted under the Constitution, being derived from the people of the United States, may be resumed," that means take back or reoccupied, "by them, whenever the same shall be perverted into their injury or oppression." End of quote. So Virginia wrote and made it known that if they were oppressed or the federal government did not live up to its obligations, they had a right to secede and become an independent nation state, which they were to begin with. New York's ratification statements regarding this right of secession were just as clear. They were stated like this, quote, "that the powers of government may be reassumed by the people whenever it shall become necessary to their happiness, that every power, jurisdiction, and right which is not by the said Constitution delegated to the Congress of the United States or the departments thereof remains to the people of the several states or to their representative or respective state governments, to whom they have granted the same." End of quote. That was found in a book, Is It Their Right? Page 62 by James M. Bullman. The ratification papers of several states clearly recognize that states' right of succession under certain conditions was legal. More importantly, by accepting these ratification statements with the right of succession clearly spelled out, the other states formally accepted those succession principles that were so stated for themselves also. Even Alexander Hamilton, who was for the international bankers, admitted succession was legal. He was an ultra-nationalist. By his own admission, Alexander Hamilton was forced to recognize that the right of succession existed within the framework of the Constitution. In regards to Hamilton, Alexander Stevens had written this, quote, "Even Mr. Hamilton must have believed that the right was incident to the system, for in his urgent appeals to Mr. Jefferson as early as 1790 for his influence with members of Congress in aid of the bill for the assumption of the state debts, he presented the strong reason that if the measure should not pass, there was great danger of secession of the members from the creditor states, which would end in a separation of the states." He was Secretary of the Treasury. Would he have urged such an argument if he had not believed that those states had a right to withdraw? End of quote. That was Mr. Stevens' book, A Constitutional View of the Late War Between the States, Volume 1, page 502. If only the federal government had not taken over the Illuminati agents in 1861 to 1865 and allowed them to continue to operate, we would have never had the war between the states. But there had to be a war according to international socialism. They wanted to end states' rights. And what is so interesting is the head of the Supreme Court, Solomon Chase, upon the surrender of General Robert E. Lee at Appomattox, said states' rights are dead. Exactly what they wanted. The 10th Amendment to the Constitution, they wanted it obliterated. They got their way. And since then, the federal government has been infiltrated. It is acting as a dictatorship over the states, and the states don't even realize what is happening to them, and they don't understand history, so they don't realize what took place with the Civil War. They thought it was over slavery. That was only something to point their minds away from the real reason for the conflict: states' rights. Mr. William Raleigh, United States District Attorney under President George Washington, said this, quote, "The Union is an association of the people of republics. Its preservation is calculated to depend on the preservation of those republics. It depends on the state itself. To retain or abolish the principle of representation, because it depends on itself whether it will continue a member of the Union. To deny this right would be inconsistent with the principles on which all of our political systems are founded." End of quote. In his book, A View of the Constitution, page 9 and page 215. You must understand that William Raleigh's book was taught to our military leaders at West Point. The southern 11 states knew their legal constitutional rights because the generals learned it at West Point, the military school supported by the United States of America. A man by the name of Alexis de Tocqueville addressed the question of secession from the Union. Quote, The Union was formed by the voluntary agreement of the states, and these, in uniting together, have not forfeited their nationality, nor have they been reduced to the condition of one and the same people. If one of the states choose to withdraw its name from the contract, it will be difficult to disprove its right of doing so. End of quote. In his book, Democracy in America, Volume 1, page 387. Raleigh and Tocqueville stated, and through their statements nailed the legal question of secession down. We have the legal right to secede under the original Constitution made between the various nation states. If the federal government in Washington, D.C. becomes a threat to impose tyranny upon the people and these separate nation states. Utopia socialist Horace Greeley, who was no friend of the South, also accepted the right of succession as given to the Union. He wrote, quote, "We hold with Jefferson that governments are made for the people and not people for the government. When any portion of the Union large enough to form an independent nation shall show that and say authentically, we want to get away from you, regard for the principle of self-government will constrain the residue to say, go. We shall willingly do nothing that looks like bribery or whittling any state or section to remain in the Union." End of quote. The book Horace Greeley, page 208 by Stoddard. The crowning irony of the secession question and the war between the South and the North is a speech given in Congress January 12th, 1848 by none other than Honest Abe Lincoln. He said, and I quote, "Any people anywhere being inclined and having the power have the right to rise up and shake off the existing government and form a new one that suits them better. This is a most valuable, a most sacred right, a right which we hope and believe is to liberate the world. Nor is this right confined to cases in which the whole people of an existing government may choose to exercise. Any portion of such people that may revolutionize and make their own of so much of the territory as they inhabit." End of quote. The book The Real Lincoln, page 66, by Charles L.C. Minor. The case for lawful secession has been made from the Declaration of Independence through and including Abraham Lincoln's own words. But what changed Abraham Lincoln's mind that he would fight the South from lawful secession? Students of world history will recognize the name Robespierre. He was a French socialist revolutionary during the time of the French Revolution in 1789, led by the Illuminati. English historian Nesta Webster commented on Robespierre. She said that, quote, "Robespierre regarded anarchy simply as a means to an end. The reconstruction of society according to the plan he had evolved with the cooperation of St. Just, which was simply an embryonic form of the system known later as state socialism." End of quote. History testifies that Robespierre was a socialist. out to transform society into what he thought that it should be, for the good of mankind, he said. He was willing to justify whatever means he used to accomplish his desired ends. He would use anarchy, terror, war, lying, murder. He felt that these methods, if they accomplished his goal of state socialism, must be good. Abraham Lincoln, called the great emancipator of abolitionist myth, has been compared to Robespierre by some historians. Historian E.A. Pollard, editor of the Richmond, Virginia Examiner during the War for Southern Independence, has written much how the North prosecuted the war. His 750-page book entitled The Lost Cause had some revealing things in it. In writing of the prevailing climate in the North during the early part of the war, Pollard wrote, and I quote, "Much of the apparent unanimity which prevailed in favor of the war was the result of terror. The people of the North seemed to have a peculiar dread of public opinion." End of quote. In writing of the actions of the Northern government, Pollard stated, quote, "But very effective measures were taken by the government in aid of this spontaneous instinct of terror. They revived the system of espionage and arrests which had been employed in France by Robespierre and Foch. At first, it was pretended that the arrested persons held secret correspondence with the Southern authorities. But soon all disguise and hypocrisy were thrown off, and arrests were made on charges, even suspicion of mere disloyalty." End of quote. Will it happen again to discredit all who will not accept the new world order that is about to come into existence? They've used the same tactics for hundreds of years. False arrests, lies to conceal their program. This Mr. Pollard noted quite correctly that in the North there was no need of arbitrary arrests, as the war was distant and the country was never really invaded, except for a small portion of Maryland and Pennsylvania in the latter part of the war. Pollard stated, yet, quote, "Yet a system of terror was established, which could only have been warrantable in the South. Yet in the first weeks of the war, a system of arbitrary and despotic seizure and imprisonment was inaugurated, which continued even after the surrender of Lee and Johnston. The number of arbitrary arrests that were made in the whole period of the war is variously estimated, from 10 to 30,000. The great mass of arrested persons never had a trial." I want to break in. What do we see today with George W. Bush and people in Guantanamo Bay denied a trial by jury? I'll continue the quote. It's talking about these people that were arrested and never had a trial and knew nothing of the charges, if any at all, on which they were imprisoned. End of quote. Some were even told that if they asked for legal counsel, that would be distasteful to the government and would prejudice their application for trial and release. The quest for simple justice is always distasteful to tyrants. it will be distasteful very soon in the United States of America, as it was in Russia and China and every other communist country. The New York Tribune reported on September 6, 1861, that 800 names are now entered into the books of the Secret Service in New York City of persons suspected of treason, and many arrests will be made, end of quote. Yes, secret police in New York City in 1861. The whole espionage sounds especially like a KGB operation in Moscow, or a CIA or FBI operation in these United States of America. There is nothing new under the sun. What happened once will repeat itself when you have evil men. That which has been will be again. It seems as if the Lincoln administration was giving us kind of a sneak preview of what is to come in the 21st century when they finally take America. Even the modern politically correct revisionist historians, although they agree with and try to whitewash the socialist emancipation of Lincoln, they are forced to concede that his administration was quite ruthless. Now, whether it's those surrounding him or whether he was in agreement with it, we will find out in due time. Those in Lincoln's cabinet were quite willing to go along with a Jacobean mindset. That's the socialist, the communist mindset. Mark Neely Jr., in his book, The Fate of Liberty, had written of the Secretary of State William A. Seward like this, quote, "When a political prisoner from Kentucky was arrested, a friend of his went to Washington to plead for his release. The Secretary of State readily admitted that no charges were on file against the prisoner. When asked whether he intended to keep citizens imprisoned against whom no charges had been made, Seward simply answered, 'I don't care whether they are guilty or innocent. I saved Maryland by similar arrests, and so I mean to hold Kentucky.'" End of quote. In other words, preserve the Union at all cost. The Union that you destroy, all of its constitutional rights, guarantees, protections that all the states came into an agreement with a federal government, all of them can be stripped away, but it's okay. The same group of socialists now have control of our government. Different names, different people, but same goals, same programs. It won't be long until the illegal arrests begin under the Patriot Acts. The willingness to kill, something to save. It is quite consistent with the Illuminati mindset. Even the North's own records bear this out. Neely states that, quote, "Just after the Civil War, the American Annual Cyclopedia and Register of Important Events of the year 1865 stated that the total number of military arrests in the North had been 38,000. End of quote. Neely's book even has a small section on torture employed by the North on pages 109 to 112. Since the same type of individuals, the socialists, the communists, Council on Foreign Relations, Marxist Front organization, the Trilateral Commission, founded by internationalist David Rockefeller, Rhodes Scholarship, and then even the Bilderberger Group, of which the governor of Texas, Rick Perry, went to their meeting.
Perry has been invited to attend the Bilderberg Conference. He'll speak to the conference on state-federal relations. The Bilderberg Conference is an unofficial, invitation-only conference of about 100 guests, and those guests include some of the most powerful people from the worlds of business, media, and politics. And the conferences are closed to the public.
All of these secret organizations are working to control America. They nearly have us, America. But what does the past have to do with today? You might be tempted to comment that this is all well and good and it's interesting history. But what does it have to do with us today? Where is the Monroe Doctrine that was in force for years? We have United States troops under United Nations command. And that command will always be a communist by agreement of our own Secretary of State, Stettness, when the United States was founded. The communist head of the United Nations military is in charge of overseeing United States' complete and total disarmament. Our military personnel that have refused to serve with the United Nations logo placed on the instead of the United States logo on the right shoulder have been court-martialed. We have troops in 100 United Nations peacekeeping territories while our borders are vulnerable to attack. The communists said they would use the soft underbelly with Mexico to come up and take America. Our Congress allowed in 1912 to 1913 the international bankers to usurp our money system. It's called the Federal Reserve System. It's neither federal nor reserve, but has sunk our people into over $9 trillion worth of debt. The United States went from the wealthiest nation on earth to the greatest debtor nation on earth, all because of the Federal Reserve System, a debt money system from which the nation can never get out unless we nationalize the Federal Reserve and abolish it, and put the right to coin money and set the value back in the hands of Congress. That way they can disperse money with no interest to the American people. The same socialists are creating the new socialist corporate state to enslave the American people and the rest of the world. We have runaway big government intrusion into our lives, a voluntary income tax to pay. But if you don't voluntarily pay it, you can go to jail or have everything that you own seized. What we are living today is a long way down the road toward state socialism. We the people did not consent to socialism as our form of government. We were guaranteed under the Constitution with the United States in Washington, D.C., a Republican form of government, the Bill of Rights attached to it. Since we were all born after the Civil War or the war between the states in 1861 to 1865, none of us have ever had the opportunity to live under the system of government that our founding fathers gave us, a constitutional republic. We are, however, living under various degrees of state socialism under the term democracy. which every socialist communist government in the world is also called. The word democracy was introduced by three men in the Roosevelt administration to substitute for republic, so they could brainwash the American people to think we were a democracy, and the next step is socialism. But let's not forget, as most students of the world conspiracy have, this socialization of America did not start with Franklin Delano Roosevelt, even though it was accelerated greatly. It didn't start with his New Deal. State socialism started with the Lincoln administration, with the surrender of Robert E. Lee at Appomattox in 1865. U.S. Supreme Court Justice Salomon Chase, on the $10,000 bill, his picture, declared that states' rights had died with that act of surrender. For all practical purposes, he said the Constitution was now invalid, and the states, both North and South, would now be subservient to the federal government instead of the other way around. Did Lincoln's administration during the war and Thaddeus Stevens and his radical Republican administration, abolitionists after the war, like Robespierre, labor to reconstruct America and its society to conform to some brand of socialism? That's the question. Those whose eyes have been opened to what is happening in the world know that it is an absolutely correct statement. They were reconstructing America. The right of state secession was more than just a Southern notion. It can be amply testified to that secession was often in the minds of states that were not in the South. No, even states in the North wanted to secede. At one time, New England had thought of seceding from the Union. Then there were those in the Midwest who thought they would secede from the Union. They didn't. And the war between the states came to make sure that this did not happen. The United States of America today is in deep trouble. Trouble that they don't even know is just lurking over the horizon. The people in America are blind. Their minds have been deviated just like the Illuminati said they would. They would give them sports. They would give them plays, trivialities, and modern times, movie theaters, television, everything to keep their mind off the political. They said they would have to make the American male weak, effeminate, basically, not willing to stand for principle, not willing to stand for what this nation stands for. One nation under God with an absolute Constitution and Bill of Rights. Have they succeeded? They said that they would have to rip out of the minds of all the population the idea of godhood, that God the Father and Jesus Christ really exist. So they're high Freemasons, skull and bone members on the courts, Supreme Court, decided that they would not allow Bible reading and any form of religion in the schools. Since that time, the children of America have been abandoned. They're not getting anything in the churches, mostly because of infiltration by the pink ministers. those who are socialists and are undermining belief in God, that Jesus Christ is divine, that there was a creation of the world, not evolution, which means the theory of evolution means we think. There is no proof that evolution exists, period, but there is proof that God exists. And so the entirety of the socialistic system that was started May 1st, 1776 with Adam Weishaupt, it was brought to America in 1829 by Francis Wright. And then British socialist agents swarmed the South, set up newspapers in the North, flamed the passions of slavery when that was not the goal at all. Many of the people in the North had slaves as well. No, it was all over destruction of states' rights so that all the states could come under one central government in Washington, D.C. And if they only had to answer to one government, then the Illuminati knew that if they took that one government, the rest would fall into place because the people does not understand what is happening to them. That they have lost their states' rights. They have lost we, the people's right as the final governors of this nation. America is on the verge of collapse. America is being threatened at every turn, but the masses can't understand it and can't see it. There is becoming an awakening. Many more people are understanding what is happening. There was a poll on CNN lately that said if America became involved in this North American community, where they would merge Mexico, the United States, and Canada, did they believe, the viewing audience, did they believe that this would end our national sovereignty? 98% said yes. But there has been no one to impeach Bush for violating the constitutional republic to guarantee the states and we the people a republican form of government. The reason Texas could not come into the Union in 1845 was because there was nothing in the Constitution that allowed for a foreign nation to come into the Union. So they had to come in through a vote of Congress. And they were annexed. This tells me something. There is nothing in the Constitution of the United States that allows the United States to merge with Mexico and Canada because they are foreign nations. They cannot be a part of the United States. However, those that are in charge, the money barons, the Illuminati that have infiltrated in the powers and corridors of Congress, they are the ones who are now taking America into this North American community. Dissolve our national sovereignty, redistribute our wealth the way Marxism says, away from America to Mexico. And that's why there is a trade imbalance in the world today. Foreigners are being raised up while Americans are being lowered in their national standard. And just as former Secretary of State, the most powerful man in the government of the United States when Richard Nixon resigned, Henry Kissinger said that it's going to be painful. Many Americans will lose their jobs, while other people, jobs are being outsourced and manufacturers are going to other countries. and Americans are losing their jobs, and it'll be very, very painful for a while.
I want to make one point about globalization. It's always discussed in economic terms that everybody is better off, but that it's only partially true. Everybody is better off on the average, but in some countries or in some regions, people lose their jobs. Major adjustments have to be made. That's the engine of globalization. The people who are disadvantaged by the process look to their governments for solutions.
He is a part of the redistribution program. He was a double agent. In World War II, his code name was Bohr. The American halls of Congress has been totally infiltrated, just like the Fabian socialists said they would do. They would take the United States of America. Nikita Khrushchev even had a book, and it came out entitled Conquering Without Firing a Shot, basically. And so America is on the verge of collapse and doesn't even know what is happening. It won't turn back to its God for deliverance. It will not turn to the book of Chronicles and cry out to God in repentance so that he can restore this land. So America will be punished for its sins. And I will pray for you, America.
Hello again, brethren. Thank you for joining us, and I hope everyone enjoyed the message today titled History That Must Be Told. Okay, for those of you who may have tuned in a little late today, the last new moon sighting was on the evening of last Sunday, April 7th, just after sunset, which marks 30 days after the sighting of the last new moon. So, for those of you who have decided to wait until after the equinox to look for the new moon of the new year, Passover will be the evening of Sunday, April 21st, which is 1 week from tomorrow. You will then go straight into the days of unleavened bread, and remember that the first and the last day of unleavened bread are high days. So for those of you who have decided to wait until after the equinox to look for the new moon, your high days will fall on Monday, April 21st for the first day of unleavened bread, and then the last day of unleavened bread will be Sunday, April 28th. And the day of Pentecost for you will be Sunday, June 16th. Well, I came across some very interesting information for those of you who were tuning in back in October 2017 and in through the first part of 2018, where I was talking about Bitcoin, blockchain, AI, the sentient world simulation, among other things. You should recall that I was exposing the blockchain system as the beast system, and how gamers, miners, and cryptocurrency itself are the heavy contributors to increasing the intelligence of the beast system. And by the way, these are some of the topics that I will be covering in more detail at this year's Feast of Tabernacles. But remember, I'm keeping the Feast of Tabernacles in the latter half of September this year. And those of you who have decided to wait until after the equinox to look for the new moon of the new year, you will be celebrating your Feast of Tabernacles in the latter half of October this year. But you're still invited to stop by and enjoy the fellowship, the friendship, the messages, and the activities. And I'll remind you of the location a little later. Right now I want to make a quick mention of some interesting news. Last month, IBM, the same company that provided punch card computing systems to the Nazis, is now laying the groundwork for a global cryptocurrency network. IBM announced the IBM Blockchain World Wire. That's what IBM calls it. And what is it? Well, it is a new real-time global payments network designed for regulated financial institutions, banks and such. And right now, the network is available in 72 countries. But IBM, of course, is actively seeking to expand that network. This new global payment network will support payments in foreign exchange in more than 70 countries. And this provides real-time settlement using a variety of digital assets. Now keep in mind how I've been talking about the blockchain being the infrastructure of the beast system and the methodology by which they got humanity to build the blockchain is through offering the cryptocurrency. The system of cryptocurrencies, the generating of this perceived vast wealth, has built the infrastructure known as the blockchain system. Now, IBM is stating that this is designed to optimize and accelerate foreign exchange, cross-border payments, and remittances. WorldWire is the first blockchain network of its kind to integrate payment, messaging, clearing, and settlement in a single, unified network, while allowing participants to dynamically choose from a variety of assets for settlement. That variety of digital assets are cryptocurrencies, and there are dozens of these fiat currencies, Bitcoin, Ethereum, just to name a couple, as well as all of the current types of fiat currencies that we are using today, like the dollar, the euro, the pound. So a foreign exchange, cross-border payment and remittance system would allow someone in the United States to use a US dollar to purchase something in Great Britain, whose monetary value is different from that of the United States. But by using the IBM Blockchain World Wire system, you could use whatever monetary system that makes you feel comfortable. To make a transaction, you just tell the system that you want to use US dollars to purchase something in Great Britain that costs £100. And the system would automatically do the conversion and finalize the transaction. And it happens in real time. There is no delay in the settlement of that transaction, and it is instantaneous. So what does it mean? It means that they're working toward a worldwide unified electronic monetary system where the entire world will be on one blockchain system. And that they will be using that to conduct all transactions. So we need to be looking for a trend in the cryptocurrency hype in the near future here. They're going to be doing something to entice people to get into cryptocurrency system again. They will do that by increasing the wealth of people in a rapid fashion, and they will do that by feeding off of greed and vanity. And once they have the majority trapped in the system with what appears to be this phenomenal amount of perceived wealth, they will then implement the beast system. They will lock everyone out of the system and require everyone who wants access to their perceived wealth to accept the mark in order to unlock their perceived wealth, in order to buy and sell. And I'm not going to go into too much detail today for time's sake, but brethren, our souls are priceless. And Satan is going to use his system to try to place a price on everyone's soul. Satan is going to hold that carrot of perceived wealth out in front of everyone and tell them, it's all yours, on one condition. So those who accept that condition and accept the mark, for whatever total of increments they have in their perceived wealth account, that's the amount that they will have sold their soul for. Brethren, it is imperative that we as Christians know the weapons of our enemy and what he's using and how he's using them against us, so that we can make sure that we have on our spiritual armor to defend ourselves against these attacks. Otherwise, we'll get sight-blinded. Brethren, I have a prayer request from our sister in Christ. Sherry Fell's brother Jeffrey passed away on March 21st. Sherry wants to extend her gratitude to everyone's heartfelt prayers and would like to ask for prayers to heal the remaining members of their family from their afflictions. Also, a special prayer for Jeff's father Morris and his children and grandchildren, that they may be comforted in this time of loss. Sherry, we're all truly sorry to hear about your loss, and we will keep you, your family, and friends in our prayers and for their comforting and understanding. And brethren, at this point, I'd like to mention that Brenda Smith would also like to extend her gratitude for everyone's continued support, as demonstrated through your tithes, offerings, donations, and prayers. And remember, your support is a tremendous help in getting God's word out to all those who have an ear to hear. So, if you found that these messages have been a blessing to you, we would like to ask in return if you could also be a blessing to us. Whatever the good Lord moves you to give and your finances will allow is always greatly appreciated. And you can send your tithes, donations, and offerings to Post Office Box 36, Waxahachie, Texas 75168. Again, that's Post Office Box 36, Waxahachie, Texas 75168. Well, thank you again, brethren, for joining us today. And please join us again next week as we continue to unfold the truth that God is laying before us. Until we meet again, do not accept the mark of the beast. And let's make all our days worthy of God's blessings. You all have a blessed week, and goodbye for now.